August 12, 1904. The Romanov dynasty finally got what they'd been desperately praying for: a son. Alexei Nikolaevich, heir to the Russian throne, arrived after 4 daughters, and the entire empire celebrated. Cannons fired, church bells rang across Russia, and Tsar Nicholas II wept with joy. What nobody knew yet was that the child they were celebrating would never live to rule. He was born with a death sentence encoded in his blood. Within weeks, the imperial doctors noticed something wrong. Alexei bled. Not like normal children bleed from cuts and scrapes. He bled from the inside. His joints would swell to grotesque proportions, filled with blood that had nowhere to go. A minor bump could trigger internal hemorrhaging that would last for days, sometimes weeks. The diagnosis was hemophilia, an incurable genetic disease passed down through European royal families like a curse. Queen Victoria had carried it, and now it had found its way into the last imperial family of Russia. The Romanov court made a decision that would define the rest of Alexei's short life. They would hide it. The heir to the largest empire on earth couldn't appear weak, couldn't appear defective. So they built an elaborate lie around a suffering child, turning him into a political prop, while his body slowly destroyed itself from within. Palace doctors were sworn to secrecy under threat of exile or worse. Servants who witnessed his episodes were dismissed immediately. The imperial family became prisoners of their own deception. By age 3, Alexei understood he was different. He watched his sisters run and play while he sat motionless, terrified that any movement might trigger another bleeding episode. When the pain came, and it always came, he would scream for hours until his voice gave out. His mother, Tsarina Alexandra, would sit beside him in a state of hysteria, praying frantically while doctors stood helpless. They had no treatment, no cure, nothing but morphine to dull the agony. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. The Romanovs didn't just hide Alexei's condition, they used it. Every time he recovered from a bleeding episode, they would parade him out for public appearances, dressed in miniature military uniforms, forced to stand for hours during ceremonies while his joints screamed in pain. The photographs from this era show a small boy with haunted eyes, always slightly apart from his sisters, always looking like he's about to collapse. Because he was. The imperial physicians kept detailed records of Alexei's episodes. These documents, discovered decades later, read like medieval torture chronicles. Bleeding into his knee joint that lasted 3 weeks. Hemorrhaging in his abdomen that nearly killed him at age 8. Blood collecting in his groin that left him unable to walk for 2 months. Each entry ends the same way. Patient survived, condition unchanged, prognosis terminal. They were documenting the slow death of a child, one bleeding episode at a time, and there wasn't a single thing they could do about it. The worst part wasn't the physical pain. It was the knowledge. Alexei knew he was dying. Court tutors later reported that he would ask them, with the casual curiosity of a child, how long hemophiliacs usually lived. When told most didn't survive to adulthood, he simply nodded and went back to his lessons. A 10-year-old boy accepting his own death as casually as accepting the weather. And his parents, instead of letting him live whatever life he had left in peace, kept using him as a symbol of dynastic strength, a crown prince who could barely stand without risking his life. The Romanov obsession with projecting strength turned Alexei into something between a prisoner and a performance piece. Every public appearance required weeks of preparation. Doctors would examine him to ensure he was stable enough to be seen. His clothes were specially designed with extra padding to protect his joints. Servants would carry him when necessary, but always out of public view. The moment crowds appeared, Alexei had to stand, walk, and smile like a healthy heir, no matter what agony he was enduring beneath the costume. Nicholas II understood the game. A weak heir meant a weak dynasty, and the Romanovs were already dealing with revolutionary movements threatening their rule. So the Tsar made calculated decisions about when to deploy his son. Alexei appeared at military parades dressed in miniature versions of his father's uniform, standing for hours while his hemophilic joints swelled with trapped blood. He attended religious ceremonies where he had to kneel on marble floors, a position that could trigger bleeding in his knees that would leave him bedridden for weeks. He was photographed constantly, creating an illusion of health and strength for a child who spent more time in bed than out of it. The imperial court developed elaborate protocols around Alexei's condition. He had special sailors assigned as his companions, strong men whose actual job was to catch him if he fell. He couldn't run, couldn't climb, couldn't do anything that normal children did. When his sisters played, he watched from a chair. When they went swimming, he sat on the shore. Every moment of his life was calculated risk management, turning childhood into a careful negotiation between appearing normal and avoiding death. But the most grotesque aspect was how the family used his suffering for political advantage. When Alexei recovered from particularly severe bleeding episodes, the palace would release statements portraying it as a miracle, proof of God's favor on the Romanov dynasty. They turned his medical crises into religious propaganda. The Russian people were told their future Tsar had been saved by divine intervention, when the reality was that he'd simply stopped bleeding long enough to survive another day. The photographs from this period tell a story the Romanovs didn't want told. In official portraits, Alexei is always seated while his sisters stand, always wearing clothes that conceal his swollen joints, always with a carefully controlled expression that hides the constant fear he lived with. Modern medical experts looking at these images can identify the signs. The way he favors certain positions, the subtle swelling visible even through clothing, the exhaustion in a child's face that shouldn't be there. Foreign dignitaries who met Alexei reported their shock at his condition, though these observations were carefully suppressed. One German diplomat wrote in a private letter that the heir looked more corpse than child, with skin so pale it appeared translucent and eyes that had seen too much pain for someone so young. Another visitor described watching Alexei at a state dinner, forced to sit through a 4-hour meal while clearly in agony, forbidden from showing any sign of discomfort because the image of a strong heir had to be maintained at all costs. The truly disturbing part was the complicity. Everyone at court knew the truth. The doctors, the servants, the nobility, foreign ambassadors. They all knew the heir was dying, that every public appearance might trigger a medical crisis that could kill him. And they all played along with the charade because the alternative, admitting the Romanov heir was fatally defective, was politically unthinkable. They chose maintaining an illusion over the welfare of a child. By age 10, Alexei had survived more medical crises than most people face in a lifetime. His body was a map of internal damage, joints permanently damaged from repeated hemorrhaging, muscles atrophied from months spent immobile, a childhood stolen by genetics and political necessity. And the worst was still coming, because the Romanovs had made a decision that would seal not just Alexei's fate, but the fate of their entire dynasty. They had let a stranger into their inner circle, someone who claimed he could save their dying son. His name was Grigory Rasputin, and he would transform Alexei's suffering into power that would help destroy an empire. In 1905, a filthy Siberian peasant with wild eyes and rotting teeth arrived at the imperial court, claiming he could heal the dying heir. Grigory Rasputin looked like something that crawled out of a nightmare. He smelled of unwashed flesh, alcohol, and something else, something that made courtiers physically recoil. His fingernails were black with dirt, his beard matted and unkempt. This was the man Tsarina Alexandra would invite into her son's bedroom, the man she would trust with the life of the future Tsar. The first time Rasputin saw Alexei, the boy was in the middle of a severe bleeding episode. His abdomen was swollen with internal hemorrhaging, his fever spiking dangerously high. The imperial physicians had done everything they knew, which amounted to nothing. They stood aside and watched as this peasant approached the bed. Rasputin didn't use medicine, didn't perform any medical procedure. He simply sat beside Alexei, looked into his eyes, and spoke to him in a low, hypnotic voice. Within hours, the bleeding slowed. Within a day, Alexei was sitting up. The doctors had no explanation. Alexandra had her miracle. What actually happened in that room is still debated by historians and medical experts. Some believe Rasputin practiced a crude form of hypnosis that calmed Alexei enough to lower his blood pressure, which would slow bleeding. Others suggest he simply told the frantic doctors to stop their useless interventions and leave the boy alone to heal naturally. Whatever the mechanism, the result was undeniable. Rasputin could apparently do what years of medical training could not. He could ease Alexei's suffering, at least temporarily. And with that ability came power that would corrupt the entire Russian government. Alexandra became obsessed. This unwashed peasant was the only thing standing between her son and death, which meant he was the only person in the empire she truly trusted. She began consulting Rasputin on everything from medical decisions to political appointments. If Rasputin said a minister should be dismissed, Alexandra would pressure Nicholas to dismiss him. If Rasputin needed money, the imperial treasury opened. If Rasputin wanted access to high society women, the court looked the other way. The dying child had become a key that unlocked absolute power for a man with no qualifications except his ability to ease that child's pain. But here's where the story gets truly disturbing. Rasputin didn't just help Alexei. He controlled access to Alexei. When the boy had a bleeding episode, Rasputin would be summoned immediately. But he wouldn't always come right away. Sometimes he would wait, letting the child suffer for hours, or even days, while Alexandra descended into hysteria. Then he would arrive, perform his mysterious calming ritual, and Alexei would improve. The timing was suspicious enough that some historians believe Rasputin deliberately delayed his interventions to maximize Alexandra's dependence on him. The imperial court descended into chaos. Nobles who had spent their lives serving the Romanovs found themselves powerless against a peasant who had the Tsarina's absolute trust. Ministers were appointed and dismissed based on Rasputin's whims. Military decisions during World War I were influenced by a man who could barely read. The Russian government became a puppet show with Rasputin pulling strings connected to a suffering child. Alexei's hemophilia had evolved from a medical condition into a political weapon, and Rasputin was the one wielding it. The boy himself understood what was happening. Courtiers reported that Alexei would sometimes beg his mother not to call Rasputin, that he would rather endure the pain than watch the chaos that followed. But Alexandra couldn't hear him. Her desperation to keep her son alive had blinded her to everything else, including the damage being done to the empire her son was supposed to inherit. She had become Rasputin's prisoner, as surely as Alexei was a prisoner of his own blood. By 1915, Russia was losing World War I, partly because military decisions were being influenced by Rasputin's advice filtered through Alexandra to Nicholas. Soldiers were dying by the thousands while their Tsar consulted a peasant mystic about strategy. The Russian people knew something was catastrophically wrong at the top, even if they didn't know the full story. Rumors spread about the mad monk who controlled the imperial family, about the Tsarina who valued a peasant's word over her own ministers. What they didn't fully understand was that all of this chaos, all of this dysfunction, stemmed from one simple, tragic fact. A child was dying, and his parents would do absolutely anything to prevent it. The relationship between Rasputin and the imperial family reveals something horrifying about power and desperation. Alexei's suffering had created a void that Rasputin filled, and in doing so he didn't just control the family, he controlled the government, the military, and ultimately the fate of millions. A hemophiliac child had become the center of a web of corruption that would help bring down a 300-year-old dynasty. And the worst part, Alexei knew it. He was old enough by then to understand that his disease wasn't just destroying his body, it was destroying his country. And there wasn't a single thing he could do about it. While Rasputin accumulated power through Alexei's suffering, the boy himself lived in a prison more sophisticated than any jail. The Alexander Palace became his cage, and the bars were made of medical necessity and political paranoia. Every room had been modified for his condition. Furniture with rounded edges to prevent injury, floors covered in thick carpets to cushion falls, windows that couldn't be opened too wide. The imperial heir lived in a padded cell, disguised as luxury. Alexei's daily routine was a masterclass in controlled existence. He woke up to immediate medical examination. Doctors checked for new bruising, signs of internal bleeding, joint swelling. If everything looked stable, he was allowed to eat breakfast, though even his food was carefully monitored. Nothing too hard that might damage his gums and cause bleeding. Nothing that might upset his stomach and trigger vomiting, which could lead to internal hemorrhaging. He ate like a prisoner on suicide watch, every bite scrutinized for potential danger. Education happened in his bedroom or a specially prepared room where he couldn't hurt himself. While his sisters attended lessons in normal classrooms, Alexei had tutors brought to him. He studied history, languages, mathematics, all the things a future Tsar needed to know. But there was one subject never discussed in his presence: his own condition. Nobody told him the full truth about hemophilia, about the genetic curse that ran through his mother's family, about the fact that he would likely never reach his 20th birthday. He learned to rule an empire he would never govern, preparation for a future that would never come. The isolation was psychological torture. Alexei had companions, the sailors assigned to watch him, but they weren't friends. They were guards whose job was to prevent him from being a child. When he wanted to run, they stopped him. When he wanted to climb, they blocked him. When he wanted to do anything that a normal boy would do, they reminded him that he wasn't normal, that he was fragile, that he was special, which was just another word for broken. His sisters tried to include him in their games, but it never worked. They would play while he watched, a ghost at his own childhood. Sometimes they would sit with him, read to him, try to make him feel less alone. But they were healthy, and he was dying, and that gap couldn't be bridged by kindness. The worst moments were when they forgot and invited him to join them, only to remember why he couldn't. The pity in their eyes was almost worse than the isolation. But the truly horrific aspect of Alexei's captivity was that he couldn't even complain about it. He was the heir, the future of the dynasty, and the dynasty required strength. So when dignitaries visited, Alexei had to pretend he was fine. When photographs were taken, he had to smile. When his father needed him for a public appearance, he had to perform no matter how much pain he was in. The prison had rules, and the most important rule was that nobody could know it was a prison. Medical records from this period show Alexei had major bleeding episodes every few months. Each one would confine him to bed for weeks, sometimes months. During these times, he couldn't move, couldn't sit up, couldn't do anything except lie still and endure. Morphine helped with the pain, but left him foggy and disconnected. He would drift in and out of consciousness while his mother prayed over him, and Rasputin performed his mysterious rituals. The heir to Russia spent more time incapacitated than active, a prisoner in his own failing body. The psychological toll was documented by his tutors and companions. Alexei developed what we would now recognize as symptoms of depression and anxiety. He would have episodes of uncontrollable crying for no apparent reason. He became withdrawn, spending hours staring at nothing. When he did speak, it was often about death, asking questions about what happened after you died, whether it hurt, whether he would see his family again. A child shouldn't have to think about these things, but Alexei had no choice. Death was his constant companion, closer than any friend. By his 11th birthday, Alexei had spent more than half his life bedridden. His muscles had atrophied from lack of use. His joints were permanently damaged. He walked with a limp and couldn't straighten his left arm fully. The boy in the propaganda photographs barely resembled the reality. This wasn't a strong heir preparing to rule. This was a damaged child being used as a symbol while his body systematically failed. And everyone around him, from his parents to the servants to the doctors, knew the truth. They all refused to speak. Alexei Romanov was dying in slow motion, and the only question left was whether the empire would die with him. The cruelest irony, while Alexei was imprisoned by his condition, unable to leave the palace grounds without elaborate preparation, unable to live a normal childhood, his parents were imprisoning themselves in a desperate attempt to save him. They had become slaves to his disease, making catastrophic political decisions, trusting charlatan mystics, ignoring the revolution brewing outside their walls. A dying child had taken an entire empire hostage, and nobody was willing to admit that no amount of power, prayer, or political manipulation could change the ending that was already written in his blood. By 1916, Russia was collapsing. World War I had become a meat grinder, consuming Russian soldiers by the hundreds of thousands. Food shortages plagued the cities. Revolutionary sentiment was spreading like plague. And at the center of this chaos sat a hemophiliac child whose medical condition had become inseparable from the political dysfunction destroying the empire. The Romanovs had spent 12 years prioritizing Alexei's survival over everything else, and now the bill was coming due. Nicholas II made a catastrophic decision that November. He left the capital to personally command the military, leaving Alexandra in charge of the government. This meant Rasputin was effectively running Russia. His advice filtered through a desperate mother to ministers who had no choice but to obey. Competent officials were dismissed and replaced with Rasputin's cronies. Military strategy was influenced by a man who thought prayer was more important than logistics. The government became a circus where the ringmaster was a dying child's ability to bleed. The Russian nobility finally had enough. In December 1916, a group led by Prince Felix Yusupov decided to eliminate Rasputin. They lured him to a palace, fed him poisoned cakes and wine. When that didn't work, they shot him. When that didn't kill him, they shot him again. Then they beat him and threw his body into the frozen Neva River. The autopsy would later show he died from drowning, meaning he survived poisoning and multiple gunshots long enough to drown in icy water. Even in death, Rasputin was difficult to kill. But removing Rasputin changed nothing. The damage was done. Alexandra had lost the one person she believed could save her son, which sent her into a state of hysteria that made her previous paranoia look rational. She became convinced everyone was plotting against her family. She isolated herself and her children even further, and Alexei, who understood more than his parents credited, knew that Rasputin's murder meant he would likely die the next time he had a severe bleeding episode. The safety net, however corrupt, was gone. The revolution came in March 1917. Not the Bolshevik Revolution that everyone remembers, but the February Revolution that forced Nicholas to abdicate. Crowds filled the streets of Petrograd, demanding the end of the monarchy. Soldiers mutinied. The government collapsed. And through it all, the Romanovs were trapped in their palace, prisoners now of the very people they had ruled. Nicholas tried to bargain, tried to maintain his son's position as heir even as he abdicated. But the revolutionary government wasn't interested in preserving a dynasty built on a dying child's suffering. The family was placed under house arrest in the Alexander Palace. The same rooms where Alexei had spent years confined by his disease now confined his entire family by political reality. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The prison that had been designed to protect a hemophiliac heir had become an actual prison for a deposed royal family. Guards watched them constantly. Their movements were restricted. They were prisoners in the cage they had built around themselves. Alexei's condition didn't care about revolutions. In April 1917, he had another severe bleeding episode. Without Rasputin, without the imperial doctors who had been dismissed or fled, with only basic medical care available from suspicious revolutionary guards, the episode nearly killed him. He spent weeks in bed, delirious with fever and pain, while his family waited to see if he would survive. The former heir to the Russian Empire lay dying in a bedroom-turned-prison cell, and the revolutionary guards outside couldn't have cared less. The Bolsheviks took power in November 1917, and the Romanovs' situation went from bad to nightmarish. They were moved to increasingly remote locations, first to Tobolsk in Siberia, then to Ekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains. Each move was more dangerous for Alexei. The journey to Tobolsk triggered bleeding that left him unable to walk for months. By the time they reached Ekaterinburg, he was in a wheelchair, his body finally giving up after 13 years of fighting a disease that couldn't be fought. The final house they were imprisoned in was called Ipatiev House, but the Bolsheviks had renamed it the house of special purpose. The purpose was execution. The family spent their last months in a few rooms, guards watching them constantly, forbidden from opening windows, living in the same spaces day after day. For Alexei, it wasn't that different from his entire life. He had always been a prisoner of his condition. Now his family understood what that felt like. They were all confined together, waiting for an ending everyone knew was coming, but nobody wanted to acknowledge. The revolutionary government was debating what to do with the former royal family when circumstances made the decision for them. White army forces loyal to the Tsar were advancing on Ekaterinburg. The Bolsheviks couldn't risk the Romanovs being rescued and becoming rallying symbols for the opposition, so they made a decision that had probably been inevitable since the moment Nicholas abdicated. The Romanovs would die, all of them, including the children, including Alexei, who had spent his entire life as a political tool and would die as one. The boy who had been kept alive at all costs was suddenly not worth keeping alive at all. July 17th, 1918, just after midnight. The Romanov family was woken and told to dress quickly. They were being moved again, supposedly for their safety because of fighting in the area. Nicholas and Alexandra knew this was a lie. But what choice did they have? They dressed their children, including Alexei, who had to be carried because he couldn't walk. His latest bleeding episode had left him unable to support his own weight. The heir who was supposed to lead armies couldn't even stand. They were led to the basement of Ipatiev house, a small room with one window and a single electric light. Nicholas carried Alexei and placed him in a chair. The family stood and sat in a rough semicircle while Bolshevik guards filed into the room. Someone brought another chair for Alexandra. They waited, confused, until Yakov Yurovsky, the commandant, entered, holding a piece of paper. He began reading in a flat, bureaucratic voice. The Ural Regional Soviet had ordered their execution. All of them. Nicholas barely had time to say, "What?" before Yurovsky shot him in the chest. Then the room exploded into chaos. Multiple guards opened fire with pistols and rifles at point-blank range. The small basement filled with smoke and noise and the screams of dying people. Alexandra and her daughter Olga died quickly. But something strange was happening with the other daughters and Alexei. Bullets were hitting them and bouncing off. The guards had emptied their guns and reloaded multiple times, shooting children at point-blank range, and they weren't dying fast enough. The reason was grotesque in its simplicity. The family had sewn jewelry and precious gems into their clothing, hoping to smuggle out wealth if they escaped. The daughters' corsets were armored with diamonds. The improvised protection was working, at least partially, turning execution into prolonged torture as bullets failed to penetrate or struck at angles that wounded but didn't immediately kill. The guards resorted to bayonets and rifle butts, beating and stabbing children who were already wounded, who were screaming and trying to crawl away in the smoke and darkness. Alexei had been shot in the initial volley, but like his sisters, he didn't die immediately. The official Soviet reports, later discovered in archives, describe what happened next in clinical detail. The boy was still alive, moaning in pain, when Yurovsky approached and shot him twice more in the head. It took multiple shots to kill a 13-year-old child who had spent his entire life dying slowly. The hemophiliac who could bleed to death from a minor injury required 3 bullets to the head before he finally stopped moving. The bodies were stripped and loaded onto a truck. The Bolsheviks drove them to an abandoned mine shaft where they attempted to destroy the evidence. They poured sulfuric acid on the faces to prevent identification. They threw the bodies down the mine shaft and tossed in grenades to collapse it. But the shaft wasn't deep enough, so they retrieved the bodies, drove to another location, and began the disposal process again. For 2 days, they burned, dissolved, and buried the imperial family like they were disposing of trash. But even in death, Alexei's body refused to cooperate. The Bolsheviks decided to completely destroy 2 of the bodies to create confusion about how many people had died. They chose Alexei and one of his sisters. They doused these bodies with gasoline and burned them for hours, then dissolved what remained with sulfuric acid. They smashed the remaining bones and buried the fragments separately from the rest of the family. The heir, who had been paraded and protected his entire life, was reduced to bone fragments scattered in an unmarked grave in the Siberian wilderness. The Soviet government claimed the family had been evacuated and were safe. They maintained this lie for decades. In 1979, amateur investigators found the main burial site containing 5 bodies, but Alexei and one sister were missing. It wasn't until 2007 that the second grave was discovered, and forensic analysis confirmed the worst. The bone fragments belonged to Alexei and his sister Maria. DNA testing verified the identity. The same genetic analysis that confirmed who he was also confirmed what he had: hemophilia, coded in his DNA, the disease that had controlled his life and indirectly destroyed his empire. Modern forensic experts examining Alexei's remains made disturbing discoveries beyond the obvious execution trauma. His bones showed extensive damage consistent with hemophilia, permanent changes from years of internal bleeding and joint damage. His skeleton was underdeveloped for his age, stunted by years of immobility. His teeth showed signs of malnutrition from the family's imprisonment. The physical evidence told the story of a child who had suffered his entire life, kept alive for political purposes, then executed when those purposes ended. The final cruel irony: Alexei's hemophilia, the condition that his parents had spent his entire life trying to hide and cure, the condition that had brought Rasputin into their lives and helped destroy their empire, the condition that had turned a child into a political prisoner, was entirely treatable by the 1960s. If Alexei had been born 40 years later, he would have lived a normal life. The disease that killed him and his empire was on the verge of becoming manageable. He was born just early enough to suffer, just early enough to die, and just early enough to take an entire dynasty down with him. The Romanovs had spent 13 years trying to save one child, making catastrophic decisions, trusting charlatans, ignoring revolution, all to keep Alexei alive long enough to inherit a throne. In the end, they lost everything. The throne, the empire, their lives, and yes, Alexei. The boy they had turned into a trophy, a symbol, a political tool, ended up as bone fragments in an unmarked grave. His short life a case study in how desperation and power can transform suffering into destruction. He was born a prince and died a prisoner, and every day of his 13 years was defined by a genetic disease that should have been his alone to bear, but instead became the weight that crushed an empire.